I was sitting at our kitchen table on a Tuesday afternoon when my mother-in-law Patricia walked in without knocking, set her designer purse on the counter, and announced that the house I'd lived in for 22 years was being returned to the family. Just like that. No warning, no discussion, just a calm statement delivered like she was discussing the weather. My husband Derek sat beside me, and I waited for him to say something, anything, to tell his mother she was confused or making a terrible joke. But he didn't. He just nodded slightly and stared at his coffee mug like it held all the answers to questions I hadn't even thought to ask yet. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating, while Patricia pulled out a folder from her purse and slid it across the table toward me. Her perfectly manicured nails tapped once against the manila surface, a sound that somehow felt louder than it should have been. I looked down at the folder, then up at Derek, then back at Patricia, waiting for someone to laugh or explain or do something that would make this moment make sense. Nobody did. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller, the walls closer, the air thinner, and I realized with a sickening clarity that the two people I trusted most in the world had planned this without me. My name is Vanessa Chen Blackwell. Though I'd been just Vanessa Blackwell for so long, I sometimes forgot my maiden name existed. I was 48 years old, married for 24 years, mother to 2 grown children who were both away at college, living their own lives now. I'd spent the last 2 decades supporting Derek through career changes, raising our kids, managing this household, making this house a home. And now I was staring at legal documents that said this home wasn't legally mine. The papers were dense with legal language I didn't fully understand, but certain phrases jumped out like knives. Sole ownership, family trust, property transfer, and worst of all, rescission of spousal interest. I felt my face flush hot with humiliation and confusion. How was this possible? I'd lived here since we bought it together in 2003. I'd chosen the paint colors, planted the garden, fixed the broken tile in the upstairs bathroom myself. Every room held memories I'd built with my own hands and heart. Patricia sat across from me with that expression she wore when she thought she was being reasonable. That slight smile that never quite reached her eyes. Derek still wouldn't look at me. My hands shook as I turned the pages, and then I saw something that made my blood freeze. A signature on page 7 that looked like mine, but wasn't quite right. Patricia began explaining in that measured tone she used when she wanted to sound authoritative without seeming cruel. This was a family decision, she said, made to protect assets and ensure proper estate planning for the future. She used words like prudent and responsible and necessary precautions, while I sat there trying to process the fact that my entire life had been discussed and decided without my knowledge or consent. Derek finally spoke, his voice quiet and strained, saying his mother had convinced him this was the right thing to do, that we needed to think about protecting family wealth for the next generation. I asked what that had to do with taking my house, and Patricia interrupted smoothly to say, "It wasn't my house, it was the family's house, always had been." And recent concerns about my emotional stability made it clear that certain legal protections needed to be put in place. The words emotional stability hit me like a slap. I'd been tired lately, stressed from managing everything alone while Derek worked longer hours, but unstable? I turned to Derek, desperate for him to defend me, to tell his mother she was wrong. He looked at his hands and said nothing. Patricia continued, explaining that the house had been purchased primarily with family money, that the title had always been complicated, and that recent evaluations suggested this arrangement was best for everyone. I realized as she spoke that I'd been quietly erased from my own story, rewritten as someone who needed to be managed rather than respected. Within days, the extended family knew. Patricia had apparently sent a carefully worded email explaining that I was being helped through a difficult transition, and that the family was supporting me through this challenging time. I found out when Derek's sister Angela called to check on me, her voice dripping with concern that felt more like pity. She said she'd heard I was having a hard time and that it was good the family was stepping in. I asked her what she'd been told, and she hesitated before admitting Patricia had mentioned concerns about my mental health, my ability to make sound decisions, and how the family needed to protect me from myself. I hung up and sat in the living room I'd decorated, staring at walls I'd painted, and realized my reputation was being systematically rewritten. Over the next week, I overheard relatives at a family gathering talking in hushed voices about how I'd always been fragile, and how Derek was handling things well, considering. My husband stood nearby and let them talk, never once correcting the narrative or defending me. I caught Patricia watching me from across the room, and when our eyes met, she smiled that same careful smile and walked over to say she'd be happy to help me pack when the time came, that she knew this must be overwhelming for someone in my condition. She said, "My condition," like it was a diagnosis, something official and concerning, when the only thing wrong with me was that I'd trusted the wrong people. That night, I cornered Derek in our bedroom and asked him directly why he hadn't defended me, why he'd let his mother spread lies about my mental health, why he'd agreed to any of this without talking to me first. He sat on the edge of the bed we'd shared for over 2 decades and told me I needed to keep the peace, that fighting with his mother would only make things worse, that I should be grateful they were letting me stay temporarily while we figured out the transition. Grateful. I should be grateful for being allowed to stay in the house I'd called home for 22 years. I asked him if he understood how insane that sounded, and he flinched at the word insane, then said maybe that was the problem. Maybe I wasn't thinking clearly, maybe his mother was right about me needing help. Something inside me shut down in that moment. Not broke, not shattered, just went quiet and cold and still. I'd spent years trying to please this man, trying to make his family love me, trying to be good enough for a family that apparently saw me as disposable. I realized I'd been begging for basic respect from people who'd already decided I didn't deserve it. That night, I slept fully dressed on top of the covers, my shoes beside the bed, like some part of me already knew I needed to be ready to run. I couldn't sleep, so at 3 a.m., I went to the home office and started going through old files, looking for anything that might help me understand how this had happened. Buried in a box of tax documents from 2008, I found bank statements showing wire transfers I'd made to cover a refinancing gap when Derek's business hit a rough patch. $12,000 from my inheritance from my grandmother, paid directly to the mortgage company. I kept digging and found more. Payments I'd made to cover property, taxes when Derek's income dropped in 2011, insurance premiums I'd paid from my freelance work in 2014 and 2015, even receipts for major repairs I'd funded when his mother had refused to help. All told, over the years I'd quietly put at least $85,000 of my own money into this house, money that had never been acknowledged or repaid. I'd done it without complaint, because that's what you do for family, for your marriage, for your home. But nobody had told Patricia about these contributions when they were restructuring ownership. Nobody had mentioned that the house they were taking from me had been kept afloat by my money during the hard years. I realized the narrative they were pushing, that I was just living in a house the family had provided, didn't match the financial facts. I started copying documents, photographing statements, building a file of proof that I'd been far more than a passive resident. The next evening at dinner, I asked a simple question about the house's refinancing history, keeping my voice casual and curious rather than confrontational. I mentioned remembering some financial challenges in 2008 and wondered how they'd been resolved. Patricia's fork paused halfway to her mouth, and her eyes narrowed slightly before she said it had been handled through family resources, nothing I needed to worry about. I nodded and asked if those family resources had included the funds I'd transferred, and Derek suddenly stood up and said, "We should talk about this later, not at dinner," and started clearing plates even though we weren't finished eating. Patricia recovered quickly and changed the subject to Derek's sister's upcoming birthday party. But I'd seen the flicker of uncertainty in her expression. She didn't know about my contributions because Derek had never told her. He'd taken my money, saved his business and our house, and then let his mother believe she was the sole financial hero of our family's story. I excused myself early and went upstairs, where I pulled out my phone and searched for attorneys who handled property disputes and family law. I scheduled a consultation for Friday afternoon, telling the receptionist I needed to discuss asset division and property rights. I didn't tell Derek or Patricia. I just added the appointment to my calendar and waited. The attorney's office was in a building downtown that smelled like coffee and new carpet. Her name was Victoria Hughes, and she was younger than I expected, maybe early 40s, with kind eyes and a firm handshake. I laid out the situation as clearly as I could. The house I'd lived in for 22 years, the paperwork giving it to my mother-in-law, the signature that looked wrong, my financial contributions that nobody acknowledged. She listened without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad, and when I finished, she leaned back in her chair and asked me several pointed questions about the timeline, the transfer documents, and whether I'd signed anything recently without reading it carefully. I told her about the papers Patricia had brought and the signature that didn't look quite right, and something shifted in her expression. She asked if I had copies of those documents, and when I said I'd photographed them with my phone, she nodded and said, "Good, send those to her immediately." After reviewing my financial records and the photos I'd taken, she looked up and said, the house transfer appeared to rely on outdated assumptions about ownership, and my contributions had never been properly disclosed or accounted for. This wasn't just marital betrayal, she explained, this was potential fraud, especially if documents had been forged or signed under false pretenses. Then she said the words that changed everything. "You have leverage here, and more rights than they've led you to believe." I drove home with my mind racing, but instead of confronting anyone, I made a decision that went against every instinct I had. I would pretend to accept my fate. That evening when Patricia stopped by to discuss moving timelines, I thanked her for her patience and said I understood the family's concerns. Her eyebrows rose slightly in surprise, and then she smiled. That genuine smile I'd only seen when she thought she'd won something. Over the next week, I played the role they expected perfectly. I asked Derek's opinion on small apartments I could rent, looked at furniture I might need to sell, even thanked Patricia for offering to help me pack. Derek visibly relaxed, his shoulders losing the tension they'd carried since this started. His mother grew smug, making comments about how she knew I'd see reason eventually, how this was really for the best, how I'd be happier in something more manageable anyway. I nodded and agreed and smiled, while inside I was documenting everything, recording conversations on my phone, keeping detailed notes of every lie and manipulation. They thought I'd folded, that the fight had gone out of me. They had no idea I'd simply stopped wasting energy on arguments and started preparing for war. I stopped defending myself, stopped explaining, stopped trying to make them see my worth. The silence felt like power. 2 weeks later, Derek mentioned over breakfast that his mother would be moving into the house permanently once I left, taking the master bedroom while he downsized to the guest room. He said it casually, like we were discussing weekend plans, not the final erasure of our marriage and my place in this family. She'd need help with mobility as she got older, he explained, and it made sense for her to be here where he could care for her. I asked where that left us, our marriage, our life together. And he looked genuinely confused by the question, like it hadn't occurred to him that giving our bedroom to his mother might be a problem. He said we'd figure it out. Maybe I could visit sometimes. Maybe we'd have dinner once a week. I was being replaced by his mother in every sense, relegated to occasional guest status in a relationship I'd built my entire adult life around. I should have screamed or cried or thrown something, but instead I smiled and said, "That makes sense. You should take care of your mother." His relief was visible and nauseating. He actually thanked me for being understanding, for not making this harder than it had to be. That night I transferred copies of all my documentation to a secure cloud folder, changed my important passwords, and opened a bank account in my maiden name at a different bank. No confrontation, no announcements, just quiet preparation for a future they couldn't control. Over the next month, I methodically separated our intertwined lives. I had my freelance income deposited into my new account. I gathered my important documents, birth certificate, passport, professional certifications from my years as a bookkeeper before the kids were born. I reached out to old colleagues, rebuilt professional connections I'd let fade while I focused on family. I documented timelines, created spreadsheets showing every financial contribution I'd made, organized evidence of every lie Patricia had told. I did it all quietly, without drama, slipping out of their control one careful step at a time. Derek thought I was job hunting for my new apartment, and I let him believe it. Patricia thought I was finally accepting reality, and I let her think it. The only person who knew what I was really doing was Victoria, my attorney, who reviewed my documentation and said I was building an airtight case. Then one afternoon, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a woman's voice said, "Is this Vanessa? This is Helen Morrison from Cascade Design. I don't know if you remember me, but we worked together years ago, and I just heard you might be looking for work." I did remember her. We'd been colleagues before I had kids, before I'd stepped back from my career to support Derek's. What happened next changed everything. Helen and I met for coffee at a small cafe near her office, and after some catching up, she said something that made my blood run cold. She told me that back in 2007, she'd tried to recruit me for a senior position at her company, one that would have meant significant income and career advancement. She'd sent me multiple emails and even called the house twice, but I'd never responded, and eventually she'd assumed I wasn't interested. I told her I'd never received any emails or calls about a job offer, and Helen frowned and pulled out her phone, scrolling back through old messages until she found them. There they were. 3 emails sent to my address in August 2007, 2 voicemails left on our home phone, all asking me to call her about an exciting opportunity. I'd never seen any of them. Helen asked if my email had been compromised, and suddenly I remembered that Patricia had been staying with us that month, helping out after I'd had surgery. She'd been answering the house phone, sorting the mail, even checking my email occasionally when I was too tired from pain medication. I'd thought she was being helpful. Now I wondered what else she'd intercepted. I asked Helen what happened with the position, and she said they'd hired someone else, but the woman had left last year, and if I was interested now, they could talk. But I was stuck on 2007, on opportunities stolen, on years of my career sacrificed while Patricia quietly sabotaged me. I went home and started digging through old calendars, journals, emails, looking for patterns I'd been too trusting to see before. The job opportunity Helen mentioned wasn't the only thing. In 2009, I'd been offered a chance to teach weekend bookkeeping courses at the community college. Good money, flexible hours, perfect for a mother with young kids. But the coordinator said I'd never called back after she left 3 messages. I'd never gotten those messages. Derek's cousin had wanted to hire me to reorganize his business finances in 2011. But he told me later he'd stopped calling because someone at my house said I was too busy with family obligations. I'd never spoken to him. A former classmate had invited me to join a professional women's networking group in 2013, but I never got the invitation. Patricia had been sorting our mail that month while I recovered from the flu. Over and over, I found evidence of opportunities that had come my way but never reached me, all during times when Patricia had been closely involved in our household. She hadn't just taken my house, she'd been quietly stealing my future for 15 years, cutting off opportunities, isolating me from professional growth, making sure I stayed dependent and small. Every job I'd turned down that I'd never actually been offered, every connection I'd lost that I'd never actually abandoned, it all led back to her. And Derek had either been completely oblivious or had known and said nothing. I realized this wasn't recent. The betrayal was decades deep. That evening, I found Derek in the garage organizing tools, and I asked him one direct question. "Did you know your mother was blocking my job opportunities?" He froze with a screwdriver in his hand, not answering right away, and that silence told me everything I needed to know. He'd known, or at least suspected, and he'd let it happen. When he finally spoke, he said his mother had only been trying to help, that she worried about me taking on too much stress, that she thought I'd be happier focusing on family. I asked him if he understood that wasn't his mother's decision to make, that those were my opportunities, my career, my choices, and he said maybe I was remembering things wrong. Maybe those opportunities hadn't been real or hadn't worked out for other reasons. He was gaslighting me about my own life, rewriting history right in front of me. I asked why he'd never told me his mother had concerns about my job prospects, and he said he hadn't wanted to upset me, hadn't wanted to cause conflict between me and his mother. I stood there looking at this man I'd loved for 24 years and realized I barely knew him at all. He'd chosen his mother's control over my autonomy, her comfort over my growth, her lies over my truth. I said, "I need space," and walked back into the house while he stayed in the garage, probably relieved to avoid a bigger confrontation. I didn't wait for their timeline or their permission. 3 days later, while Derek was at work and Patricia was at her book club, I hired movers and took everything that was mine, my clothes, my books, my grandmother's furniture, my personal files, everything I'd brought into this marriage or purchased with my own money. I'd found a small furnished apartment across town, nothing fancy but clean and mine, and I moved in on my own terms. When Derek came home to a half-empty house, he called me panicking, asking what I was doing, where I'd gone. I told him calmly that I was taking the space I'd said I needed, that I'd be in touch through my attorney about next steps. Patricia called 20 minutes later, and for the first time in the 24 years I'd known her, she was crying. Real tears, real panic in her voice. She asked, how could I do this? How could I just leave? Didn't I understand how this looked? What people would think? I almost laughed. After everything she'd done, she was worried about appearances. She begged me to come back, to talk things through, said she'd never meant to hurt me, that I was misunderstanding the situation. I told her I understood the situation perfectly, that I had documentation of everything, and that she should direct all future communication through Victoria Hughes, my attorney. Then I hung up. Control was slipping from her hands, and for the first time in decades, I wasn't there to help her hold on to it. Within a week, things started falling apart for them in small but significant ways. Derek called saying the gardener needed payment, and he didn't know how much or when it was due. I'd always handled that. Patricia left a voicemail asking where I kept the insurance paperwork because something needed to be filed. I'd always managed that too. Bills started arriving late because I'd been the one tracking due dates. The house alarm went off at 2 a.m. because nobody remembered the code I'd changed last month. Derek's sister called confused because nobody had sent her daughter a birthday card, a tradition I'd maintained for 15 years. The refrigerator broke, and Derek didn't know who to call for repairs. The yard service threatened to quit because nobody had paid them in 3 weeks. Patricia showed up at my apartment unannounced, looking exhausted and frantic, saying I needed to come home and help, that things were falling apart without me. I asked her what she thought I'd been doing for 22 years if my absence could cause this much chaos in 1 week. She didn't have an answer. Her carefully maintained world had been running on my invisible labor, and now that I was gone, the machinery was grinding to a halt. She saw it now, what I'd been worth, but only because I'd stopped doing it. I told her through my door that I wasn't coming back to fix what they'd broken, and she needed to leave my property or I'd call the police. She left, and my phone rang constantly for days afterward. Derek started pushing for reconciliation. He sent flowers to my office with cards saying he missed me, asking me to please come talk. Patricia left messages saying she'd been too hasty, that maybe we could renegotiate the house situation, find a compromise. My attorney called to say Derek's lawyer had reached out about setting up a mediation, that they wanted to discuss the property matter without involving courts. The shift in tone was obvious. They'd gone from dictating terms to requesting negotiations. When I finally agreed to meet them at Victoria's office, Derek brought Patricia, both of them looking hopeful and nervous. They sat across from me in the conference room, and Patricia started by saying there had been misunderstandings, that she'd only wanted what was best for the family, that perhaps she'd been too aggressive in her approach. Derek said he wanted to work things out, that our marriage mattered more than property, that he'd convinced his mother to reconsider the arrangement. Victoria let them talk, taking notes, while I sat quietly and listened. Then Derek pulled out new papers, saying they'd had their attorney draw up a revised agreement that would let me stay in the house with certain conditions. Basically, I could live there, but ownership would remain with the family trust, and I'd need to agree to regular financial oversight to ensure stability. They were offering me the privilege of staying in my own home if I accepted permanent supervision. I looked at the papers, then at Victoria, who gave me a small nod. I said I'd need time to review this with my attorney. Victoria and I went through their proposed agreement line by line, and she pointed out every trap embedded in the language. If I signed, I'd be agreeing that the house had never been marital property, that I had no ownership claims, that the family had always been the primary financial support. I'd be giving up any right to challenge the original transfer, accepting regular audits of my personal finances, and agreeing to vacate with 30 days' notice if the family deemed it necessary. Basically, I'd be signing away every right I had while accepting their narrative that I was financially irresponsible and needed management. Victoria asked if I wanted to countersue, and I said not yet. I wanted to see how far they'd push. 2 days later, I met Derek alone at a coffee shop and told him I needed more time to consider, that it was a big decision. He seemed relieved, said of course, take all the time I needed, and told me his mother was just worried about protecting family assets. I asked him gently if he'd told her about the money I'd put into the house over the years, and he shifted uncomfortably and admitted he hadn't, that it seemed like bringing up old history. I asked him to tell her now before I made any decisions, because I wanted complete transparency. He agreed, looking uncomfortable but hopeful. That evening, Patricia called me screaming, asking how dare I try to extort the family, claiming I'd contributed money when everyone knew Derek had supported me financially all these years. She'd snapped, and her mask had finally come off completely. Patricia showed up at my apartment the next day, and when I wouldn't let her in, she had her meltdown in the hallway where 3 neighbors could hear every word. She shouted that I was selfish, ungrateful, manipulative, that I was tearing the family apart over money I never actually had. She said I'd been a burden on Derek for years, that she'd supported us more than I'd ever acknowledged, that I was ruining her son's life by refusing to be reasonable. She accused me of lying about job opportunities, about financial contributions, about everything. Her voice got louder and uglier, and she called me names I'd never heard her use before. She said I was a leech, a gold digger who'd trapped her son, a nobody who'd contributed nothing to the family. This was the woman who'd smiled sweetly at family dinners, who'd presented herself as the concerned mother-in-law, now screaming in a hallway that I was worthless. My neighbor opened his door and asked if everything was okay, if he should call security, and Patricia finally stopped, realizing she had an audience. She looked around at the witnesses to her rage, and something in her face shifted. Fear, maybe, or recognition that she'd gone too far. She smoothed her hair, gathered her purse, and walked away without another word. I went back inside, sat down, and carefully typed out notes about everything she'd said, every accusation, every insult, with the date and time and names of witnesses. I was building a record. The mediation Victoria scheduled happened in a neutral conference room with Derek, Patricia, their attorney, Victoria, and me. I brought 3 folders of documentation: bank statements, wire transfer records, receipts, copies of checks, photographs of the forged signature, screenshots of emails, a timeline of every financial contribution I'd made, and affidavits from Helen and 2 other people about opportunities Patricia had blocked. Victoria presented everything methodically, walking through 22 years of evidence that demolished their narrative. Derek's face went pale as she showed wire transfers he'd apparently forgotten about or never bothered to mention to his mother. Patricia's attorney kept flipping through pages, his expression growing more concerned. Victoria then presented evidence that the signature on the property transfer documents wasn't mine. I'd had it analyzed by a handwriting expert who confirmed the forgery. Their attorney asked for a recess, and when they came back, he looked grim. Patricia tried to interrupt, to explain, to justify, but her own attorney told her to be quiet. Victoria laid out the facts. I had substantial financial stake in the property. The transfer was based on fraudulent documents, and Patricia had engaged in a pattern of interference and manipulation spanning 15 years. Then Victoria said if this went to court, she'd be seeking not just property rights but damages for emotional distress, fraud, and lost economic opportunities. The room went completely silent, and even Patricia had nothing to say. Derek asked for a private moment with me, and we stepped into an empty office down the hall. He looked broken, older than he'd looked a month ago, and he said he'd had no idea about most of what Victoria had presented. His mother had told him she was protecting the family, and he'd trusted her. He'd been manipulated too, he said, believing her concerns about my stability were real, believing she had our best interests at heart. He said he'd been blind and stupid and wrong. He apologized for not defending me, for choosing his mother over me, for letting her control our lives. He said if he could go back and change everything, he would. He asked if I could forgive him, if we could start over, if our marriage could survive this. I looked at this man who'd shared my life for 24 years, and I felt sad more than angry. He'd been his mother's son longer than he'd been my husband, and that had never changed. I told him I didn't know if forgiveness was possible yet. But I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't about forgiveness or reconciliation or saving our marriage. This was about making things legally and financially right. About me reclaiming what had been taken. Whatever happened to us personally after that was a separate question. He asked what I wanted, and I said I wanted the truth acknowledged and the damage repaired. Everything else could wait. The settlement took 6 weeks to finalize. The house title was corrected to show joint ownership, acknowledging my financial contributions and removing the fraudulent trust transfer. Patricia had to pay me $85,000, the exact amount I documented putting into the property over the years, plus legal fees. Derek agreed to a formal separation with fair asset division. I didn't ask for revenge or try to destroy anyone. I just insisted on accurate legal records and appropriate compensation. What surprised me was the extended family's reaction. Patricia had apparently tried to control the narrative again, sending emails about how I was being unreasonable and vindictive. But Derek finally found his spine and sent his own message with the truth. The forged documents, his mother's interference, my financial contributions, everything. Some family members didn't believe it at first. But when multiple people confirmed the timeline and others admitted they'd witnessed Patricia's controlling behavior over the years, the story Patricia had built started crumbling. Derek's sister called to apologize for believing the lies about my mental health. 2 cousins sent messages saying they'd always suspected Patricia was too involved in Derek's marriage. Even Derek's father, who'd stayed mostly silent through everything, called to say he was ashamed of his wife's behavior. Patricia's reputation, built on decades of careful image management and control, collapsed publicly. The woman who'd been the family authority, whose opinions had shaped decisions and relationships, was suddenly exposed as the source of division and manipulation. 3 months after the settlement, Patricia asked to meet me for coffee. I almost said no, but curiosity won. We met at a cafe far from both our neighborhoods, and she looked smaller somehow, less certain. She didn't apologize right away. Instead, she talked about how she'd built her identity around being the family matriarch, how she'd believed she was protecting everyone, how control had felt like love. Then she admitted something I hadn't expected. She'd been terrified of me, not of anything I'd done, but of who I was, independent, capable, strong-minded. She'd seen me as a threat to her influence over Derek, and she'd spent 24 years trying to diminish me to protect her position. She said she'd never meant for it to go this far, that each small interference had seemed justified at the time, and she hadn't realized how deep the damage went until it was exposed. She said she knew I'd never forgive her, and she wasn't asking me to. She just wanted me to know she finally understood what she'd done. I asked her if she expected me to feel sorry for her, and she said no, she expected nothing. I told her that fear wasn't an excuse for abuse, that protecting your position wasn't the same as protecting your family, and that she'd destroyed her relationship with her son by treating his wife like an enemy. Then I stood up and walked away while she was still trying to form a response. I didn't owe her closure. I started rebuilding my life piece by piece. Helen offered me that position at Cascade Design, Director of Financial Operations, good salary, excellent benefits, and I took it. I moved into a better apartment with a view of the mountains. I reconnected with old friends I'd lost touch with while trying to please Derek's family. I joined professional organizations, took courses in advanced financial software, started building the career I should have had all along. Derek and I finalized our divorce quietly 8 months after the settlement. It wasn't angry anymore, just sad and final. He'd chosen to move his mother into a retirement community where she'd have support and he'd have distance, and I respected that choice even if it came too late for us. Sometimes I saw him at family events for our kids, graduations, holidays, and we were civil but not close. The trust was gone, and we both knew it wouldn't come back. Our daughter asked me once if I hated her father, and I told her no, I didn't hate him. I was just disappointed that he'd chosen comfort over courage when it mattered most. What surprised me was the peace I felt. For years I'd thought my worth was tied to that marriage, that family, that house. Losing it all had felt like losing myself. But I hadn't lost myself. I'd finally found her again. The woman I'd been before marriage, before motherhood, before 24 years of trying to earn love from people who saw kindness as weakness. A year after everything fell apart, I stood in my new apartment and realized I'd gained something more valuable than property or money. I'd gained autonomy, self-respect, and freedom from people who'd mistaken my patience for permission to control me. Derek had lost his mother's influence but not her presence. She still called him daily, still tried to manage his decisions, and he still hadn't fully broken free. Patricia had lost her authority in the family, her reputation, and her son's blind trust. They'd traded temporary control for permanent consequences. But I'd traded betrayal for liberation, and that was a victory that mattered more than any revenge could. I wasn't bitter anymore. I was free. Free to build a career on my terms, free to make decisions without seeking approval, free to exist without justifying my worth. The betrayal had broken something in me, but not permanently. It had broken the chains I'd wrapped around myself, trying to be good enough for people who'd never intended to see me clearly. I learned that family loyalty shouldn't require self-erasure, that love shouldn't feel like management, and that walking away from people who diminish you isn't cruelty, it's survival. And if there's one thing I'd tell anyone facing similar betrayal, it's this. Family betrayal hurts more than any enemy. But healing without hatred is the real revenge, because you can't control how others treat you, but you can absolutely control whether you stay and accept it.